This video serves as a general introduction to developing research questions. While many of you may feel that beginning research is simply putting a topic in Google and then figuring out what happens, that's not the best way to carry out a research project. The best way is to begin with an understanding of your topic through topic funneling and an initial research question. The purpose of a research question is to guide exploration and to help guide your research toward conclusions, solutions, or answers. Let's take a look at the characteristics of good research questions. This is provided by the University of Maryland Global Campus. Good research questions do not have a single answer. This means that they are open-ended and can explore cause and effect of various components, even those that aren't understood when the question is asked. They are researchable. You can find an answer to them based on research, facts, or data. They open the door for other areas of research and inquiry. Good research questions beget more questions. They often begin with how, why, what, or which. They provide those open-ended question starters that really get you through multiple components. And they pass the so what test. Are these questions interesting to someone else? Is there a reason to spend time researching them? University of Maryland Global Campus also tells us about bad research questions, or in this case, we're going to call them weak research questions. Weak questions have simple or easy answers. They can be answered in one word, a number, or a quick list. Or they cannot be answered. There's no answer, or there's no information or way of testing it that can provide an answer to the question. Sometimes the question can only be answered with an opinion. Therefore, there's no hard data or information that can be used. Or it limits the amount of questions that can be asked in other places of inquiry. They often begin with who, when, where, how much, or how many. Simplistic question stems that provide simplistic answers. And they do not pass the so what test. No one really cares about what the answer is to a weak research question. It may be useful to visualize research questions on a spectrum that looks like an inverted pyramid. At the top wide part of the pyramid, you have questions that are far too broad. These questions typically have too much information available. It's impossible to sort through them, which can make it impossible to answer. At the apex of the pyramid, near the bottom, you'll find that there's questions that are far too narrow, meaning there's not enough information available to answer the question. The question may be impossible to answer, or it may just be too easy to answer. Both questions that are too broad or too narrow will limit the ability you have to complete research and to produce quality work. You want to try to meet an area just slightly above the apex, above that area of too narrow. This is called the sweet spot. This place provides you with a question that is complex enough to have research, but also narrow enough to manage the amount of information that's available. Now that we've looked at characteristics of strong and weak research questions, let's talk about the appropriate ways to develop your research question. The process begins with a preliminary question. This is often developed from the topic funnel, and it's usually what we consider a weak question. It's often based on the researcher's existing knowledge and biases. The preliminary question helps to guide the preliminary research. The preliminary research often isn't a deep dive into what exists. It's typically a broad overview that looks at what other scholars have said. Has the question already been answered? Or did the researcher learn something new? The preliminary research helps inform the question revision. Using the information that was found in the preliminary research, the question may get modified. This may mean going back through the topic funneling process, or simply revising terms and expectations of the question. The question gets more specific and focused, and it may be different from the preliminary question, and that's okay. This revised question then informs the continuing research. This continuing research can be looking at further document sources. It also may be the actual experimentation and research process itself. You can continue to do the topic funneling process in the continuing research. You may also revise your question multiple times through this continuing research process. Finally, after going through all of this, you will come up with your final question. The final question is likely to come up during your continuing research process. Your final question may be very different than the preliminary one, and it takes into account preliminary and continuing research. However, though you see the final question sitting at the end of this process, do not think that your final question should be changed to fit the research. That's not how it works. Your final question should be informed by this entire process. So while your question may be different at the end than at the beginning, the question should still be informed by the research and inform the kind of research that's done, not changed to fit with what is found. Let's do an example, following that process through to the very end. Here is my preliminary question. Is Game of Thrones a depiction of medieval life? This is what I want to know. So, in order to answer my preliminary question, I do some preliminary research. This may be a quick search on Google or Google Scholar, or looking at a few journal articles and historical reviews on EBSCO. What I find is that yes, Game of Thrones is a medieval fantasy. It's based on a period of history in England called the War of the Roses, and it draws from multiple countries and their interactions during the War of the Roses. Has my preliminary research actually answered my preliminary question? The answer to that is yes, in a way. My preliminary question was very, very specific. Is Game of Thrones a depiction of medieval life? My preliminary research has answered that question for me, but it has also led me to new questions and new information. What was the War of the Roses in England? And how did these different countries interact? And what was that impact of the war on different places? So my question begins to be revised. Now my question is, how does Game of Thrones fictionalize historical events in a fantasy setting? I've taken my interest in the Game of Thrones books or TV series, if you will, combined it with my preliminary research, and found a new area of inquiry that I can look for. Now I go through the continuing research process. This research is guided by my revised question, which is looking at historical events and fantasy settings. This continuing research may look like me doing some historical analyses, looking at timelines of the War of the Roses, exploring political connections between individual countries, and also looking at literary devices, and the way that fantasy settings are used to tell stories. After exploring a variety of sources and information through my continuing research, my question continues to evolve. At the end, the question that I really want to answer is, how do the fictionalized events in Game of Thrones align with what is known of the historical events of the War of the Roses? In essence, I want to be able to figure out, how does this fictional story match with the historical period, and how are they actually shown through this fictional fantasy setting? The continuous iterative process of asking questions, doing research, and revising the questions can help lead you to what the final research goal is for your specific topic. In this case, if I was to conduct this research, my goal would be to produce an analysis of Game of Thrones in comparison with known events. I may look at key pieces or scenes or characters in the book and compare them to their real life counterparts to see how they match up.